Welcome back. Now, in the first quarter of 2025, South Africa's youth unemployment rate, specifically for those aged 15 to 24, reached 62.4%, while among those aged 25 to 34, the rate stands at 40.4%. This means of the 10.5 million people aged 15 to 34 who are available and willing to work in the first quarter, 4.8 million were unemployed. South Africa's youth unemployment rate has stubbornly remained above the 40% mark since the third quarter of 2020. And joining me to review the country's youth in the labour market is Bridget Evans, CEO of the SAB Foundation, and Bronwyn Williams, economist and business trends analyst at Flux Trends. Thank you so much for your time, ladies. We really appreciate it. I want to start off with you, Bronwyn, coming in from the eye of an economist. Is it not too much for us to expect a turnaround in the unemployment crisis in South Africa, particularly for youth, when it also reflects the broader problem of unemployment across the board?
Yeah, I think one of the first things we need to get right if we want to fix this, if we want our young people to have fulfilled and fulfilling careers and to become economically independent, so they're able to actualize and flourish, we have to actually make sure that we are diagnosing the right problem, using the right information. And our unemployment statistics, as you currently cite them right now, have flaws in both directions. On the one hand, that data is not covering underemployed youth, that is, people that are employed but still living below the poverty line. And these are, of course, the sorts of people who are likely to identify as unemployed in order to not risk losing their social grants, for example. But also it represents the great societal challenge of graduates who are working not in the fields that they studied in, not earning effectively the sort of income they need to pay back the time and money they've invested in education. That's where we start to see these figures being under-reporting the current reality. But at the same time, it's a different challenge where these figures also sometimes over-report the current reality. Because just like there are employed people who identify as unemployed for the reasons I've articulated here, there are also people who identify as unemployed but do nonetheless have some sort of income, whether that be from an informal side hustle, whether that be from friends and family, whether that be through untracked, untraced grey economy activity. My point is the numbers that we're looking at here do not reflect accurately either of those realities. And we know, of course, we've had, for example, the CEO of Capitec in the news recently saying that he thinks our unemployment figure is a lot lower. Yeah, but perhaps also our underemployment figure could be a lot higher. And in order to solve any problem, we need to first understand the world as it is, the challenges and that reality and all its nuances, and only then are we able to make solid policy decisions to address the challenges that are definitely among us.
You've actually touched on quite a number of things, and I'm also wondering then, how does the tax authority look at that underemployment and those kind of gray areas as well? And you are right, there's really just been a lot of debate on whether we are getting the right information and how far certain things should be included in the statistics that we get from Stats SA. But now, when we talk about unemployment, usually what comes up is a normal job, Bridget, a normal 9-to-5 job. And we never really think of the role of entrepreneurship in this equation. Well, talk to me then about how entrepreneurship is viewed in this ecosystem and really where it comes in and where it could come in to actually solve this crisis.
I think entrepreneurship has a huge role to play. I think we often hear in the news, and it's often quoted in various settings, that SMMEs are going to be the job creators of the future.
Yeah.
And the thinking is that a lot of smaller businesses will create the jobs as opposed to a few big companies in the country. And if we believe that statistic, then we really need to nurture that the entrepreneurial landscape, because what I've seen and the challenges around it really are that you've got a massive amount of entrepreneurial activity.
Yeah.
But if you look at, say, for example, the FinFind report that was just published, which really looks at those seeking funding and what does that landscape look like, who's seeking funding, who's getting funding, and all of that, there's a massive funding gap. They estimate it to be around 350 billion rand, where there's a mismatch between supply and demand, where the supply of capital won't go where the demand is because that demand is deemed to be too risky. And so really for us to try and create, and if we're serious about it growing SMMEs and about them being job creators, which they are, they can be, you know, we as a foundation, that's all we do. And we've seen a lot of job creation, you know, over 12,000 jobs in with a fairly small financial intervention. But I think that is where the challenge lies. And I think there are major reasons on both sides of the fence why there's that mismatch between supply and demand. It's not just the investors' fault, because the investors have had their fingers burnt trying to operate in this space, where default rates have been high. On the entrepreneurial side, one of the biggest challenges we see is that they are not financially literate. Many entrepreneurs, they focus very heavily on sales, but the whole financial management side is very uncomfortable for many people, so they neglect it. And as a result, when they do come to the point where they're wanting to seek finance, they're uninvestable because they have no evidence of previous performance and nothing to project future performance. And so it's somehow you've got to try and figure out how you close that gap. And I think commercial investment only will never solve that gap, will never close it. So as a country, we need to figure out how we create an enabling environment for SMMEs to grow. And that, I had someone who said to me, but what happens if a young person doesn't want to be an entrepreneur? And I said, well, they don't have to be, because they can go and work for an SMME, you know? We're not saying everyone needs to be an entrepreneur, but those that do have good businesses, we really have to focus on helping them grow.
There is so much I want to unpack there. But I mean, this entrepreneurship conversation also spills over to what you're saying, Bronwyn, is that in essence, a lot of the Gen Zs are entrepreneurs. They're freelancers, and you could be a freelancer being a stylist, and you have to hire a PA, you have to hire all sorts of people, a digital marketer. So, I mean, in that space, they also do create employment. And I'm just wondering as well, because you talk about a gray area where their side hustles aren't really visible, or whether it's their side hustle or their main source of income. If they're not visible, then they're in that gray area. What then do we need to do to actually create support for their businesses and for their endeavors? Do we need to create systems that actually look into these gray areas?
Well, we are looking at systems that peer into the gray areas. There is obviously huge incentive, both from tax practitioners and governments on the one hand, but also from the banking sector, both the established banking sector and the new generation fintechs, who see the sort of subterranean, so-called gray, invisible economy as a major, perhaps the only major source of growth in an otherwise quite stagnant economic environment. So there are huge drives going on at the moment, everything from Gauteng's sort of government putting pressure on the taxi associations to digitize within the next 2 years, all the way through, of course, to governments and fintechs increasingly disincentivizing the use of cash, even though young people, like our research with Student Village shows, would prefer to use cash because it is invisible, but also it has less transaction fees. But there's lots of financial incentives and lots of people looking to effectively pick the gray economy as a form of growth for themselves, right? And that might not be in the best interests of people who currently operate within the gray economy, although it could be. It all depends where these systems are put in place to digitize them in order to empower that sector of the economy,
Yeah.
or whether to effectively extort tolls from it, which is a very different way of kind of looking at this great project to digitize, track, and trace every single transaction. The real question we should be asking, if we are serious about development in our country, is to what end are we digitizing? And to what end are we doing things that are dragging us kicking and screaming into the future? Are these things that are going to add inclusive growth, or are they going to sort of compound the vast inequalities that we already see within our country? And you made an interesting point earlier. We're talking about SMEs. That's the one thing here. But the other thing we have to look at investing in is effectively the entrepreneurs of one, the sole entrepreneur, the sole business person, the individual that is increasingly looking to kind of incorporate themselves. And what are we doing to empower that? Because the other big elephant in the room here is that even if we are looking to SMEs to employ a lot of our unemployed and to employ them in a more formal sector environment, that's also part of the subtext here.
Yeah.
That's not necessarily going to be all that sustainable if you don't have a growing overall economy. Instead, increasingly individuals, whether you're lucky enough to have a formal job or not, are having to become more financially independent. Job security isn't what it used to be, and this idea of landing a job equals financial success, or the idea of economists and policymakers looking at employment rates as a measure of the success of the economy, also things that we need to question. So questioning a lot of those assumptions around informal versus formal economy, being better slash worse. What is it actually doing for the individual? And again, questioning these ideas around economic success equals being employed by someone else, as opposed to perhaps in the future being economically successful means being self-sufficient and having a sort of Swiss Army skill set that you're able to employ and deploy for your own good, for your own gain, for yourself, even outside of the context of formal employment or formal ownership. And these are sorts of ideas we might want to experiment with based on the sort of chaos of our current economic environment here in the African context in particular.
Bridget, you made quite an interesting point that not everyone wants to or needs to be an entrepreneur, and it really goes to a point that I wanted to make, because you have this desperate and urgent need for people to get money now, and many entrepreneurs develop businesses that are good for hand to mouth, where the businesses are not sustainable, they're not scalable, to the point where when an entrepreneur gets an opportunity for employment, that business stops existing. So then how does the business ecosystem and investors into entrepreneurship like SAB actually make entrepreneurship more attractive in terms of the support you give, where it's more attractive than employment for people who have started that entrepreneurship journey?
Yeah, I mean, you are going to get that very survivalist type business where they are just doing it because they haven't been able to find a job and they have to survive. But I think we certainly see it. I mean, we get 7,000 applications for, in fact, it's 7,600 applications for 84 spots a year on our entrepreneurship programs. And what we have done is we have seen significant growth on our programs, and then we went and we added a loan fund. Now, the foundation has a very specific mandate of trying to reach into township and rural areas with regards to the businesses that we support. And one of the things that I will say is that I think a lot of where the opportunities lie are in those sort of areas where you've got a huge lack of goods and services, and you've actually got a community with limited income, but they do have some income to pay for certain goods and services that they find valuable. And we see incredible business ideas coming from those areas where the businesses actually do quite well. I mean, those townships, yes, they do not put their money in a bank. But I mean, we've come across like Sinyamas where they are turning over 100,000 Rand a week and burying it in the back garden. That's the kind of stuff we see. And So I think there's definitely a distinction, but I agree with Bronwyn, what Bronwyn said about Gen Zs. There certainly seems to be an appetite for a lot of young people to start their own initiative. We see a lot of it. And I think it's really about determining the entrepreneurial, first of all, capability and spirit of that person. And that really comes down to how you select. So that's what we do. I mean, they're very small businesses, but we can tell that this is an entrepreneur that really wants to grow. And we've seen evidence of what they've achieved before we even got there. And so, I think it does depend.
Okay, and just lastly, as we close off the conversation, the time has gone on very, very fast for this very, very important topic. But just, Bronwyn, with these shifts now that we're seeing with these new economic sectors, do we then maybe need to craft a new agenda in the country in terms of what our economy is made up of, and particularly the labor market?
Yeah, exactly. I really do think we need to look at different indicators of success at a macroeconomic level, but also at an individual level. We need to tell ourselves new stories about what a successful, flourishing life looks like if we're going to set our children up for success. At the moment, many young people who actually are doing quite well, self-employing themselves, getting by, and really should be applauded by society for their resilience and for their initiative, instead feel like failures because they don't have that traditional job, because that's what we've told them a successful, stable life looks like. So we do need to relook at those indicators, both the qualitative ones and the quantitative ones. And as policymakers, we really do need to start interrogating these unemployment statistics that we use to govern our policy, and to start thinking a bit more laterally about the real data, the real insights, the real people behind those real top line numbers that might not be yielding the sorts of insights we need to actually help more people to live the kind of lives that they want to live, and to add value to society in a way that society appreciates them right back.
Oh, well, thank you so much, ladies, for that very, very insightful conversation as we wrap up Youth Month. Really, really appreciate your input here. That was Bridget Evans, CEO of the SAB Foundation, and Bronwyn Williams, economist and business trends analyst at Flux Trends.